Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. Years after the subway first opened here, and over, what is it, almost 24 years since light rail started running here, visitors as well as Angelenos are sometimes still surprised that there's a subway in Los Angeles. Why is that?
Well, I think it speaks to the extent of the route itself, and it doesn't actually cover a huge amount of ground over LA. Part of that is that it is still very much a work in progress, but I think the other part is that LA is simply huge. It's an enormous city. It's really a region, and it's if you look at the county, for example, it's the size of Delaware and Rhode Island combined. Many people can live, work, and play within, without being anywhere near where a subway or light rail stop is. And on top of that, for a lot of people, they're going in so many different directions around LA that the subway or the light rail system is not really going to be all that convenient for them. That's sort of the negative side. I mean, the positive side, of course, is that there are a lot of people who do live within the rail transit corridors who do take advantage of it. But I think the fact that it's a work in progress and the fact that Los Angeles is so large is why people aren't familiar with the system. And on top of that, Los Angeles has this reputation of being a car culture, and so I think a lot of people just sort of assume that's always going to be the case, and the city is just always going to be locked in that 1950s vision.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from the UCLA School of Law, where I'm speaking with Ethan Elkind, who is he's an attorney, he's a writer and researcher on environmental law, both here at UCLA School of Law and at UC Berkeley's School of Law. He's also a musician with 2 albums to his name and a new book called Railtown: The Fight for the Los Angeles Metrorail and the Future of the City. It is, as someone who rides the trains here all the time and someone who moved here with that in mind in order to do so, it's one of the main books that could interest me right at this moment. But tell me this, reading that title, even just the title, The Fight for the Los Angeles Metrorail, it sounds a little like a book about, how one of the world's great cities fought for a power grid. Like, yeah, what? Like, it doesn't, you think about it for a second, like, why a fight?
Well, everything is contentious in a city like Los Angeles. It's a decentralized city, so there's, someone once commented, it seems like there's no one in charge here. Certainly there's the mayor of LA, but on big regional issues, you have big splits between a county, which is dominated by 5 supervisors, and then multiple cities throughout the county. And they're all competing for funds, for getting projects in their jurisdictions. They're competing for sales tax dollars, et cetera, et cetera. So coming to an agreement on something like a rail system, which is meant to unify the whole region, but really unify the most densely populated parts of the region, becomes a real battle. So that's why I called it The Fight. And on top of that, it's something that is still a work in progress, as I mentioned. And it also, if you just sort of, take a step back and think about what it means to bring rail to Los Angeles, it's a fight because you've got so many different sources of opposition. Not only do you have infighting among people who maybe want that rail and are fighting because they want a line, and they'll hold up the system if they don't get it, or they'll hold up the system if it does come to the neighborhood because they want it to go somewhere else. But you also have people who say this is a waste of money, or I won't benefit from this, or LA is too sprawling and it's a car city. So you have multiple sources of friction that kept the system from getting built, and it delayed it to the point where it really explains why it's still a work in progress, because LA got such a late start, and a pretty lucrative window for building transit closed right as they were really getting their act together. And so it's been much harder for them to get a system set up compared to a place like Washington, D.C. or San Francisco or Atlanta.
It's one of those much discussed elements of Los Angeles lore, the old Pacific Electric red car systems and Los Angeles Railway yellow car system. And even Who Framed Roger Rabbit has the big laugh line about it. You wouldn't need a car in Los Angeles. We have the best transit in America. Got even more of a laugh in '86 than it does today, but it still does. And that system was, of course, dismantled. And there seemed to have been a window between the early 1960s, when those rail systems went away, and the late 80s when it started coming back, where people just sort of dismissed out of hand the idea that there could be rail in Los Angeles or rapid transit of any kind. Indeed, they just say, dismiss it. Oh, they've done studies. It ain't going to work. Somehow, was there a tipping point where people stopped thinking they've done studies, it ain't going to work?
So, what happened in LA actually mirrors what happened all across the country. So when you talk about the streetcar system, I get a lot of, if I get any sort of feedback or from activist types on the book, a lot of it is you really should be hammering that conspiracy. The car companies dismantled the streetcar system. And in my research, that did not bear out. So I don't subscribe to that conspiracy theory. You saw it all across the United States that streetcars were great before the automobile, and especially for real estate developers who wanted people to be able to drive at the land values basically for their subdivisions and provide people a way to live in a more suburban lifestyle and then use transit to come into the city. But as cars took off and their growth was exponential, the streetcars lost favor. I mean, if you're living in an uncrowded Los Angeles and it's flat and it's pleasant climate, you would love to have an automobile provide you the freedom to get anywhere you want to go. And by contrast, the streetcars were slow. They were relatively expensive. People felt like they were being taken advantage of. So as the real estate developers stopped subsidizing them, because they never were money makers, the public did not want to step in to rescue them and voted down a number of ballot initiatives to rescue them. So that's just sort of that background. And you saw this all over in cities all across the United States. So there was a window, as you say, between the 60s and the 80s, but really the streetcars had been declining before then. And I think what happened between the 60s and 80s, to answer your question about the tipping point, is that things got so bad in LA once they had made the decision to really just wholeheartedly embrace the automobile. That decision made sense when LA was not that densely populated, but it was an unfortunate decision to let go of, especially of the rights of way that the rail cars were on and start building on them, because no one took into account the ongoing population boom in Los Angeles. And
it's odd given how population boom driven the development of Los Angeles was. These ads saying our population is going to quadruple in 20 years, things like that. That was what it was all about, right? It was more people coming.
Well, a great book, The Reluctant Metropolis, describes this. Bill Fulton, I was a planning director at San Diego now, but he describes it as the growth machine, and that LA, it had industries, but they sort of came up later. A lot of what sold LA and what kept the economy going here was the real estate boom. So they were out there advertising in the Midwest and the East, come to LA, and it's not a hard sell. If you're growing up in a much frigid, polar vortexy part of the United States, LA is a very attractive place. I mean, my grandfather actually took a road trip in the 20s, saw LA and made sure he moved out here, and he raised my mom here in LA. So he was just one of millions of people who were attracted by the lifestyle. And so in a way, it was a bit of a pyramid scheme at first, because it was the growth and the real estate sales that really fueled the economy here until other industries could take hold. But to a certain extent, that boom is still going on. I mean, that's, real estate developers need a population boom because that's where they get the demand.
People had to, I would imagine, know pretty quickly, though, that if the city was going to get denser and denser and denser, the car thing wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to play at some point, right? This wasn't a secret, I don't think.
Nobody wanted to face that fact.
You work in environmental law, so you know that process where nobody wants to face something a consequence of their not collective actions, but a consequence of what everyone's doing.
Yes, exactly. And all you had to do was look at the charts of the population growth. And so it made no sense why they would build, for example, the 405 and 101 interchange to accommodate, I forget how many cars. And it was basically, it met that within a decade, and is now completely jammed. But no one was really taking into account that population growth. And I think the same mistake is being made now, because part of the argument around rail transit is that, hey, this provides a great opportunity to reorganize development patterns in LA and accommodate that growth that we know is coming to the city.
It's something you touch on in the book, another argument for rail that people make. It's not one that I necessarily make, but that it will get cars off the road. Where it seems to me in my travels to various cities, no city worth visiting does not have severe traffic problems, no matter how much rail, how much transit of any kind they have. That's inevitable, and it's to sell a rail system here by saying it'll get cars off the road. That's going to create problems of its own, right?
Absolutely. The system was, I think, pretty badly oversold to voters. And
sold to a voter in a car who wants other cars off the road.
Exactly, right? Well, let's build a rail car so we get all these other cars out of the way so you have an easy commute. That was not an accurate prediction. It doesn't make sense. You have to do a population growth, and it's really an alternative to traffic. It's not necessarily a traffic reliever. Although if you can divert a few amount of those trips to transit and of course bike and pedestrian ways of traveling too, does make a difference for traffic. But yeah, we're dealing with increasing growth, minus a plague or major economic collapse, which of course we all hope isn't going to happen. But that was one of the ways it was oversold. It was oversold on how cheap it was going to be, how quickly they could build it. Now some people say this is sort of deliberately done by politicians to just sort of make the sale. There may be some of that. I think there definitely was a lot of wishful thinking. But I like to give them the benefit of the doubt to some extent. And when they were making these arguments in the 70s, we hadn't seen a lot of modern rail systems at that point, and LA certainly hadn't built one. So they were dealing, in a sort of best case scenario because of a vacuum of information. And from their perspective, I think better to assume the positive side. I think a lot of these politicians tend to be optimists. That's why they would even go into politics to begin with. So there was this sort of dynamic that did lead to a lot of dashed expectations, opened them up to a lot of criticism later. Mm-hmm. I think things have improved though. People, the readers and media are a lot more savvy. The audience for the politicians, I think the politicians themselves are more savvy about it now.
You mentioned this vacuum of information. I wonder, yes, in the 70s, there was not a whole lot of rail building going on in the States, but they could look to other countries and see how things have been done there, right? In various other capitals outside of America. I mean, they must have learned something from those, or did they not?
Well, I think other cities and other countries did inspire, particularly Los Angeles. So when you had the original movement for rail in the 70s, I think really personified by Mayor Tom Bradley, they talked about Los Angeles needing to join the sort of world-class city category, of Paris and in New York to some extent. So they had East Coast city models. But in a large ways, those cities weren't a great comparison to LA. LA was sort of the first, mega city founded on the automobile and really popularized that. So there weren't a lot of analogs. And on top of that, in a European context, for example, you'd had, high gas taxes. You'd had a lot of policies to discourage automobile usage, and you had much more ancient compact cities. In the East Coast as well, you had compact cities that had grown up before the automobile. And in a way, it actually hurt the cause in LA. A lot of transplants from the East Coast came to LA deliberately fleeing that high density, cramped, subway. And I've read in some of the politicians' files that I went through in the archives for this book, a lot of letters to them from angry neighbors. And you saw all sorts of things, subways are spawning grounds for filth and scum and, a lot of racist, homophobic, allegations around the subway. So that actually was a negative experience. But later on, LA did take its cues and continues to take its cues from South American cities. So Curitiba in Brazil is a great example, which inspired the bus rapid transit line here. Ciclavia, of course, is an import from South America.
Just the other day, in fact, that happened.
Yes, exactly. So LA is paying attention, I think, more so to innovation, partly out of necessity because we don't have this kind of public funds that we once had to build these transit systems. So we have to look to other countries that are making do with less, and we're taking our cues from them.
The contrast between how rail building happens in America and other countries is fascinating, though. You mentioned the 70s and what was being built, if anything, here in the States. And I think of, well, you're from the San Francisco Bay Area. That's where BART was being built in the 70s. And I use BART every time I go to San Francisco or the whole Bay Area. And it's useful, but it bears the marks of having been designed and built in an era that wasn't really accommodating to rapid transit. It's just weird, isn't it? BART. I mean, what do you think of BART?
So, I am from the Bay Area, and I deliberately bought a home near BART so I could take advantage of it. I'm a fan of traveling by rail transit, so I'm biased here. But if you do look at BART, it is kind of an odd system. It was really pushed by downtown business leaders in San Francisco, not unlike LA, where downtown business leaders were really worried about LA downtown declining and thinking that rail would be a way to rescue it. Same thing happened in the Bay Area. And what they were worried about was that businesses would start to locate outside of downtown San Francisco. So BART became a way to bring in professionals from the suburbs into the financial district specifically. So it really wasn't built to sort of create transit-oriented development, to allow density nodes and, really convenient neighborhoods around the BART stations. It was just really a way to bring commuters in just to downtown. So it doesn't serve San Franciscans very well, for example, which is odd.
Yeah, most of them I know who live in the city essentially never use it unless they have to go to the airport, but it's a recent thing that was available.
Yes, exactly. No, I mean, a Muni streetcar system is much more useful.
I mean, it may stop for no reason for minutes at a time, but it is more useful than BART.
Yeah, and there is talk now of extending BART in different directions and trying to serve the population areas. And I personally would like to see BART de-emphasize its service out to the far-flung suburban areas. I mean, BART is a heavy rail technology, meaning the power comes from the third rail down below. It's very expensive to operate, very expensive to build, and it's really meant for a high density Tokyo, Singapore kind of environment. So the idea that it travels, an hour outside of San Francisco, almost like an Amtrak line, it's kind of absurd. So I'd like to see that BART service really focus on the urban core of the Bay Area. And LA's got that hybrid system too now, where we have the subway, Red Line subway, and hopefully soon the Purple Line subway down to Westwood, where we are right now.
Soon.
And that's going to serve a dense corridor in Wilshire.
Right,
and
yes.
so that's an appropriate technology. Although one thing, I don't think I mentioned this in the book, but they only have 6-car train capabilities on the subway here in LA.
Because of the platform length, or?
So they basically shrunk the platform length, I think to save costs. I never actually got to the bottom of why that happened, but I'm almost positive it was to save costs. But the problem is, as that train goes down Wilshire, it's going to be jam-packed. And, BART has a 10-car train platform, and that's jammed already. So it's going to be a long-term problem for LA. In some ways, a good problem to have. It means they actually got it built and have the ridership, but it's something to think about, and it's going to be very expensive, if not impossible, to go back and retrofit those stations.
I remember reading, I think it was Sir Peter Hall's book, Great Planning Disasters, of which BART is one of them that he includes, and he does describe it. The way he describes it makes it seem like a total fiasco. And in your book, Railtown, it's less fiasco-oriented, but it's more about just the grinding politics of it all. Is this an American thing, this type of politicking needed to build something as basic as a rail system?
Well, it does speak to our system of governance here in America and California in particular. As I mentioned at the beginning, this decentralized nature. We love democracy. We like the fact that, nobody sort of tells us what to do. It's not like China where they can just build a rail line and snap their fingers. And here we respect property rights, et cetera, et cetera. The downside of that is you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and you have, decision by committee, and the loudest person in the room or the person most willing to sort of strong arm others is the one who's going to carry the day most times. So that's, sort of the sacrifice that we make. And rail just becomes this, living embodiment of all the compromises we have to put in place to get something done. I mean, you think about, something like Obamacare, for example. Those compromises, people don't exactly see them what went in to get that passed. But with a rail line, you literally see this rail turn this direction when it doesn't make sense to go that direction. So it becomes this physical embodiment of a consensus-based process that is not the most efficient, but it's a balance that we seem to have wanted to make. Now, I think, we did build rail lines in the past when we had democracy. So things have changed. I think they've sort of tipped in the last half of the 20th century towards empowering citizens, which often means empowering opposition groups. So in my mind, I think we need to bring the dial back a little bit to focusing more on a regional good and the regional benefits and less on empowering individual groups, because it tends to favor those who are well-resourced and sophisticated and not necessarily representing the greater interest.
It's interesting you mention China and their style of governance, because I don't know if you saw the movie Her. It's Spike Jonze's recent movie Her, where it's set in a future Los Angeles, where you never do see a car. You see a lot of rail, though. And they actually build the Los Angeles of the future in this movie out of pieces of Shanghai as well. So it's a Chinese-looking Los Angeles in the way that, say, Blade Runner's Los Angeles was a Japanese-looking Los Angeles. But working in actual pieces of China into Los Angeles, I mean, is there some sort of secret longing for a severer, more efficient way of governance, way of building being expressed there, do you think?
Well, it's an interesting question. I've heard about the movie. I have 3 small children, so getting to the theater is a challenge for me. But and I've seen some of the stills of the subway maps. And it's an interesting vision, and I think it probably reflects this idea that we're just growing, population-wise. My guess is the people behind Her have never been to a planning commission meeting and seen what kind of fights go on over even a relatively small density project. So it's hard to get that kind of thing built. However, I think in some ways it might ring true because, there's a new generation of Angelenos. So they have millennials who are much more interested in a convenience a convenient lifestyle, walkable, bikeable, transit. They have seen the limits of suburbia. They've seen the limits
Grew up in them. I mean, I certainly did. The limits are right in front of your face.
Yeah, exactly. And, they've seen the insanity of sitting in traffic for your whole life. And meanwhile, you've got a smartphone that can take you anywhere you want instantly, mentally, that is.
Right.
And they want to kind of mimic that in a physical way. So millennials are much less interested in the car culture. The surveys show that. Now, some of that may be related to the recession, the fact they didn't have the kind of purchasing power that other, newer generations had when they were coming out of the gate. But I think there is a real cultural shift going on. And on top of that, you've also got a lot of Latino immigration and just natural population growth. And Latinos also, by and large, favor transit and that kind of urban walkable lifestyle. So those trends are really converging. And beyond that, the percentage of households with children is declining to a real low. So you've got a lot of people without kids who have no need for the suburbs, no need for that kind of lifestyle, are happy to walk and bike. They're not carrying 3 kids around like I am. And so there is a sea change going on. And the real estate community acknowledges this. So even the sort of business as usual developers, the sprawl guys, they're shifting now to building more mixed use, dense projects. I don't think LA is going to turn into Shanghai unless we radically reform our system of land use decision making. But I think we are heading towards a more dense future, mainly out of a response to people's desires, because they don't want to move an hour and a half away to get an affordable house and then have to deal with that commute and the expense of that every day.
Right. And as you say, even though you do have the 3 kids, you are in a house near a BART station. So you really, it's not even a divide. There's not even that divide anymore. Like, well, here's your families in the suburbs. Here's everybody else, the young and the old people in the cities. It's something more fundamental changing, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is this misconception that we have to Manhattanize all of LA. I mean, you can have really convenient neighborhoods even in the suburbs, but it's a matter of not segregating the uses. So you don't have everyone in the houses here and you got to cross a 6-lane, boulevard to get over to the school or the shops. And everything's connected by transit. So there's ways of really designing neighborhoods, not just, subdivisions. And that's, I think, where we're going. So it takes a mix of things. And part of why I like this vision of density around the transit stations is because it does preserve a sort of outlying areas. If people need those single family homes to raise kids or they just want the space, you kind of preserve that option for people, but you also have the option for those who don't want that to have a convenient lifestyle. Take the elevator downstairs, grab a bagel, hop on their bike and, head down to a park or walk out over to the subway stop. I mean, that's a really nice lifestyle and it fits for a lot of people. It's not something that's being forced on them, by a Soviet style, planning entity. This is something that really reflects what people want. It's a more exciting, more convenient way of life.
It's certainly how I do things. I live in Koreatown, near the Wilshire Western Station for those playing the home game. But the food isn't bagels, but it's good stuff nonetheless. It's funny. I think of that word Manhattanize, and I know Eric Garcetti, the current mayor, took some heat for the quote-unquote Manhattanization of Hollywood when he was overseeing Hollywood. But part of me really is just like, please, will you please Manhattanize the rest now? Are you going to do that? I mean, but what do people mean when they say Manhattanize? Because that's never... I just used it positively, but I think I'm the only person to have done that. Usually it's someone already in Los Angeles complaining that something's about to be Manhattanized. By which should they mean what, do you think?
So I think people fear density if they're not already living in it, and if they already are enjoying their neighborhood that's not high density. People are afraid of traffic impacts. They're afraid of losing the character of their neighborhood. And I think Manhattan, for a lot of people who move to LA, feels like this. You're sort of stuck in this canyon of buildings, and it's dark, and people are pushing and shoving, and it's really unpleasant. So part of LA is a bit of a fear of other human beings. We like to segregate ourselves, in our cars and in our homes, et cetera. So there isn't as much of a public culture here. And so I think, it's been a magnet for people. And then for people who move here, that becomes reinforced. Those tendencies become reinforced. So there is a sort of knee-jerk fear. But I agree with you. I mean, for a lot of people, Manhattanization is not a negative thing. And a lot of people, maybe not Manhattan, but maybe Brooklyn kind of lifestyle, they really enjoy and they see the advantages of that. And the point is that LA should be a home for all sorts of people. And so if you don't like Manhattan, then there should be parts of LA you can live in and enjoy and be happy. And if you feel resentful that you moved to LA for whatever reason or grew up here and you're forced to buy a car and sit in traffic, there's an alternative for you too. And you don't have to live that lifestyle if you don't want.
Right. I think it's almost, I'm coming back to a question I've already asked, but it does seem like that idea that a city would ask of its citizens, you have to buy this big machine that's going to be between $5,000 and $50,000, and you're going to need it to do everything. It's like the power grid thing. It's like the city saying you're going to have to buy your generators and use your generators, each individually. Like it seems almost insane to me when I say it to myself like that, but then it did persist for a long time that way. So I don't know which. You get to think, am I the insane one? You know what I mean? That this sort of like, it seems so implausible. You call it a very ridiculous period, don't you? Or a period of ridiculousness, or what's your actual word? This whole political agony that has gone on for decades to make the Los Angeles Metrorail system.
So I think there was a reviewer, I think, who
actually, it wasn't your word?
It wasn't my word, but it's basically Angelenos had lived through an absurd era or something to that effect. And, that is true. But like I say, part of me feels like it's always been absurd. It is absurd right now. You just have to take a step back and look at a rail line to really drive that home. Maybe a bad choice of words with drive. But so, this is democracy. Democracy is absurd. You get weird people coming out of the woodwork. You have weird selfish interests represented. So it's not done by a bunch of technocrats who are looking out for the greater good. It's done by just a sort of, roll up your sleeves and get into the ring and let's see who emerges, standing. That's kind of, seems to be how we like to do things here. But absolutely, I mean, it is absurd that we force people to buy cars basically if they want to, access the basic things in LA. That's sort of the deal that we have here. And I think as gas prices go up and with traffic and air quality and everything else, people realize the limits of that. But I think even now, people don't necessarily take those sort of monthly transportation costs into account, when they're thinking about buying that cheaper home way out there. If you really add up, the transportation plus housing costs, you may be better off, spending a little bit more on your housing to live in an area that's much more conveniently located.
When we're talking about rail in Los Angeles, are we really just talking about density in Los Angeles?
So I think the two have to be inextricably linked. Unfortunately, they haven't been when the system was being built. There was a rail agency building it, and then you had all these cities and, the county having land use authority. So there was some disjointedness going on. There was the hope by a lot of these rail planners that, hey, once we build it, the real estate side will come. But they weren't real estate developers. They didn't understand how challenging that is. That A, you've got local land use restrictions, parking requirements, zoning, all sorts of things that keep it from happening. And B, a lot of times you're siting rail lines in areas that are pretty industrial or blighted in some way.
In freeways.
Or, in the middle of a freeway where there's no possibility of that. And that's actually another failing of the BART system too. And so to get a market started there, you're not going to invest money in a more expensive, tower of apartments if you don't think anyone actually would want to move to that area. So it wasn't that simple, but the two have to go together.
You do see a pretty stark difference in places where rail stations are in Los Angeles, and there are quite a few stations. I mean, as I say, I'm in Koreatown, Wilshire, Vermont, Wilshire Western. There's big condo towers going up or already up. Less so around Normandy for some reason. But then, you see the outer reaches of the Gold Line in freeways or the entire Green Line. I don't think the Green Line has anything you could call transit-oriented development anywhere, is there?
It was really just sort of conceived of as an end-to-end line. It was supposed to serve the defense contractor industry in El Segundo, and then bring in those workers from the eastern part of LA County. And, of course, right before it opened, the defense industry collapsed with the end of the Cold War. So they never built it that way. And I write about it in the book, but in a way they were sort of backed into approving that line because there was a settlement on the Century Freeway that allowed for a transitway in the middle. And so they felt like it could be a busway, but this is a great opportunity to pretty cheaply just get another line going. It looks like the ridership's pretty good. Let's just green light it. and it all sort of fell apart, and also ended up not being as cheap as they expected to build it. Caltrans did pay for some of it because they were building the freeway, but it ended up being not the best place to put the second light rail line in LA. And I gather the ridership now is pretty good.
Yeah, but it's always on time.
It's always on time. It's because it's in the middle of the freeway. It goes fast. But it was not conceived of as a way to stimulate development along the line. It was really an end-to-end thing. And the other big tragedy about it, I think, is not just the defense industry collapsing on that side, but on the other side, it stops short of the Norwalk Metrolink station, just a couple miles. It dumps you off just in the middle of the freeway under an underpass, which is disorienting and unpleasant to be in. And then, and Norwalk wouldn't allow it to go through the city. And by the time they got a new city manager who said that they wanted to have it come through, it was too late. They'd spent the money and done the plans. So connecting that might be something that the region should be thinking about.
This is illustrative of something I found. When I'm introducing friends from outside of town to the Los Angeles metro system, they're usually pretty impressed at first, and even when they leave sometimes, but along the way there will be so many uncomfortable questions that come up, like, well, why does the subway just stop at Western? Why does the Green Line go to neither LAX nor to that Amtrak station? Why does the Blue Line go past all these empty factories, it seems like? It's just a number of questions that I couldn't answer before, really. Now I can, thanks to your book. But I don't know whether it's illuminating or aggravating that for all of these questions about why there are all these problems, there is a perfectly logical answer that is well documented in politics and in the decisions made. Like, nothing is unexplained in Los Angeles Metrorail history, is it?
No, it's all explained. It just doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it make sense. It's just an explanation for it.
Yeah, sometimes I would prefer if nobody knew. Why doesn't the train go to LAX? I don't know. And this is another thing. As I say, I'm a writer. I'm a Metro writer, and I appreciate a lot of the advances it's made. But Metro itself seems like they're always trying to put forth the image of not knowing what their own problems are. There was a video a while ago they put out about the LAX gap with the undertone of almost like, oh, no one told us the train didn't go to LAX. Or I remember the Wilshire rapid bus, so-called. I live near a stop for that and use it sometimes. I was talking the other day with Doug Sussman, who did an urban designer who did the aesthetics for those rapid buses. And I was like, it's funny how you put so much work into these things and it still doesn't have its own lane, does it? He's like, don't get me started. We got started anyway. But the thing is, I was seeing these advertisements for it a while ago for the rapid bus that Metro put out on the subway train. And it was saying, it takes you straight to wherever from downtown. What's not to love? So on. I couldn't help but take to Twitter and be like, well, starting with the lack of a lane. And you rattle off as many things as you can in 140 characters. And Metro replies to me with their official account. They say, well, I guess we'll put you on the not in love list. I was infuriated by how dismissive that sounded. Why does... I understand why Starbucks needs to promote itself like they don't understand what their issues are. Why does Los Angeles Metro need to do that?
It's an odd agency, and the book goes through this sort of agency history to some extent. It started off, there was really one agency here in LA, the Southern California Rapid Transit District, and then because of frustration with that, it was running the bus system, and there were all these strikes. A couple supervisors got together and started the Los Angeles County Transportation Commission. They got state legislation passed. So then there were two agencies that were fighting, and then they combined them into Metro in the early 90s. And it's an odd entity. It's responsible, for a huge area, a massive transit system, and it's governed by elected officials, political leaders. So you have a lot of conflicts of interest in how it's run. But beyond that, there's an odd culture in Metro. I mean, I'm not an expert on it. I've dealt with some of the folks there, and they're all really nice to work with, but there is this odd sort of public-facing dynamic. I don't know. Maybe they're on a siege mentality, and they just kind of want to act like everything is great. But you definitely have this sense of corporate PR speak, rather than just sort of humanizing themselves and just acknowledging that they're a product of that they're really sort of a victim in some ways of a really messed up political system and a board that also has a lot of conflicts of interest in the decisions that they make. But they're in a tough spot. They're sort of everyone's. Sort of whipping post. I mean, they're not one of those popular entities. I mean, sort of like a electric utility. I mean, basically, the best they can hope for is that no one's really paying attention to them, because that means nothing's going wrong. Right.
Again, the power grid comes up. But yes, I think that every Metro rider wonders who to blame. They even no matter how much they like the service, there's something's going to happen, or they won't be able to get somewhere they need to, where they think, what happened here? Who do I point the finger at? And it seems like a lesson of your book that there's never going to be any one person, is there?
Well, there are some individuals who played a disproportionate role. So if you're upset that the subway doesn't go farther down Wilshire, I think you should blame Henry Waxman.
Yes.
I think that's pretty clear.
We all do.
Yeah, and I think if you're upset that the Expo line wasn't built sooner, there are definitely a number of officials. I think Zev Yaroslavsky is an example of that. He definitely championed the homeowner opposition to that line, when it was first kind of being discussed seriously in the 80s and 90s. You also have, basically you can kind of go back in history, and there are individuals who did play an outsized role in twisting things around. But, that is part of the problem, that when there's kind of a sense of no accountability, and even those people who opposed him, Yaroslavsky's termed out, Waxman stepping down, these people just, fade off into the sunset, and everybody's left with a system that's compromised and not as effective as it could be. So that's why ultimately it's up to Angelenos to, they're the ones who are going to be riding it, living with it. It's up to them to sort of agitate for better decision making.
And even those two fellows, Waxman and Yaroslavsky, you can find eras where they definitely were getting in the way, other ones where they don't seem to be, other times where you think, oh, well, they said this and that, maybe they're actually on the side of transit. Like it seems like they're on the side of, like any politician needing to keep their jobs, right? So the people who I'm responsible to, what do they think? Even if it's homeowners who don't want a subway station coming in, then that's who they're going to try to reflect, right?
Yeah, one of my favorite lines in the book was someone who said they talked to a state senator. They were trying to get the Expo line out there, and they said, you know what? You start the parade and I'll march in front of it. Right. And I think that's sort of their mentality.
Summation of a political career.
Yeah, and so, that's why, someone like Supervisor Yaroslavsky changed his tune, because the politics changed. And that's, again, where, the group residents here can get together and they can have a huge impact by organizing and forming a pro group as opposed to just the usual opposition group. And politicians really need to see that, because there is a silent majority out there in favor of good decision making, but they don't feel invested in it. They're not organized, and they're busy doing other things and just assuming that their elected officials are going to do the right things. But what happens is they're silent, and then, if a powerful opposition group comes around, politicians are going to be more attentive to those who are loud and motivated, rather than just trying to please a silent majority that they think is probably not paying attention and maybe not paying attention.
So when did the Los Angeles Metrorail system become an object of interest for you, whether as a prism for politics or in any other sense?
So it actually started here at UCLA Law. I was a law student here, and of course I'd moved to LA before I even thought I was going to go to law school. And coming from the Bay Area with BART, I was pretty surprised. I moved here in 1999. I was just surprised that the region didn't have rail transit. I didn't understand a lot about rail, but it just seemed like it made sense to me. And I'd, be driving along Wilshire and stuck in traffic and thinking, boy, if everyone here just, collectively got together, we could all build an awesome rail line. We could get out of this traffic. I didn't understand all the economics, all the politics, all the, the engineering issues, and so on and so on. So that was sort of my initial take on LA. This place is crazy for not having transit. But then when I got to law school, I did a paper for the former dean here, Susan Prager. And I did a history of the Metrorail system because I, kind of got wind that it existed. I was living on the West Side, so I didn't have any direct contact.
You could never have gotten wind potentially, but you did.
So yes, exactly. So I saw that it was there, but wanted to know, why isn't it going more places? What in the world is going on here? So that's what really got me interested. I did that report, that paper, seminar paper, and just thought this is a crazy, fascinating story. And I made the decision, which also maybe was crazy as well, to decide to write the book. But I'm glad I did. It was a lot of fun to write.
Tell me about when you do get a chance to ride the Metrorail system here, what the experience of writing it now tells you. Whatever line you're writing, wherever you're trying to go, what can you draw from the actual on-the-ground user experience of it?
Well, so it's one thing to ride the stations. It's another thing to sort of look at the environments around them. And I'm very focused on the environments around them. So, for example, when I'm riding the Blue Line, I'm just looking around thinking, where are the development opportunities? I mean, I'm not a real estate developer, but, where are the ways that we can really maximize the benefits of this system? And often I'm disappointed on the light rail line, certainly the Green Line or the Blue Line, that this is going through an area where I just don't see a lot of potential. The Gold Line the same way. And it's, but I have different thoughts on different lines. The Gold Line, I'm thinking, why is this so slow? Right. How can we be driving this just as fast? and basically twice the amount of time. The red line, I remember my first thought riding it was just odd exhilaration / bewilderment. Like, I can't believe I'm doing this in LA. I cannot believe I'm in a subway. It feels like any other city, but I'm actually underneath LA. So that's the thing I feel about the red line. I still have that feeling. But then when and I'm also fixated on how never seems that crowded when I'm on the train. So maybe that's because don't tend to go on during commute hours.
Go to North Hollywood at rush hour, I guess, and you'll have to stand. But it's not like Japan. It's not like you're getting pushed in by a white gloved attendant.
Yeah, and BART, it's just gotten packed in the last 15 years. I know ridership is up in LA, but I am surprised. I do focus on how crowded or uncrowded the train seems, and then when I get out of the stations, I just look around, and definitely the route up Vermont, for example, I just think, man, this is kind of crazy that you have this multi-billion-dollar subway system and you've got these low-rise projects all around here.
Right. What do you? I don't know. This isn't about blame. What's something that causes that just keeps development from developing around some of these stations? As I say, Wilshire, Vermont. Okay, there's stuff going up. You go a little bit north, and you come out at Denny's and whatnot.
So there's a couple things going on. First, you do have pockets of density in LA, and you ideally you want to just build the subway where people are already living in high concentration. So actually your neighborhood in Koreatown is a good example. Downtown LA, there already was density there. So that's part of it. But then the other part, and this is what's happened to a large extent, is that they didn't have a lot of money to build the system. Tunneling was very expensive, and there were some existing rights of way. The Blue Line is a classic example, and it was much easier to just build the line there. But it wasn't where people were already living. So part of it is the siting decisions, where they decided to go. I mean, they decided to go Vermont instead of Fairfax. Fairfax, I think, is a little bit more densely populated than Vermont, but more importantly, it's farther out at Wilshire, so you would have picked up more of the Wilshire corridor. And that was a conscious decision for political reasons to save money. So the siting decisions are part of that. But then the other part is that these projects are hard to get approvals from a lot of these communities. So where you have a wealthier area like a Santa Monica or even, Hollywood, where you've got, neighborhood groups around there that care a lot about the downtown, they can put the kibosh on the land use plans, which you saw in Hollywood with Mayor Garcetti when he was council member Garcetti. And then you also have areas like the Blue Line where there just isn't a market. People aren't going to be clamoring to live, on that part of LA County. It's not a desirable place.
No one's going to live by the Willowbrook station, you're telling me? No.
Yeah, I mean, there are people, of course, who live there now, and it is densely populated in its own way, but they're sort of, it's a low income area where people are crammed into single family homes. But, it's a bit of a loss. It's more of an end to end system like the way the Green Line was conceived of, where it's really to bring people from Long Beach, the second largest city in LA County, into downtown. And it's been successful in that way. I mean, it's got the highest ridership of any light rail line in the country, with the caveat that Boston's lines, there's no one individual line, that a bunch of lines feed together. So it's not really apples to apples, but the point is it's a well-ridden line.
I have the same question you do when I ride the Gold Line. Why is this so slow? But I have it about all the above ground lines, actually. Even the Blue Line going to Long Beach. Part of me says this line it has a high ridership. It'll never be the success it was envisioned to be because it takes an hour to get to Long Beach, like that. And not even just the stops at the traffic lights coming out of downtown, but the train, they just go slow. Whether you're thinking about the Expo or the Gold Line or the Blue Line, I mean, why did they just straight up move slowly? You know what I mean? Like they're slower than anywhere else I go in the world.
And they can go fast. There's no engineering restriction on that. The trains can go 60, I think it's even 70 miles an hour. Well, it's going to be worse when the Expo line opens. It's already, I rode it from Culver City into downtown, and I feel like that was 40 minutes. I mean, we're looking at, at least an hour to Santa Monica. And, that's competitive travel times, unfortunately, during rush hour. But, I've driven, home from, downtown LA to Santa Monica in the evening. You can get home in 15 minutes. Why would I want to spend an hour on a train coming back? And not to mention the door-to-door times, just getting to the train station or wherever my destination is. So why do these trains go slow? A big part of it is how they're built and how they're operated. So when I say how they're built, they're built and as, oftentimes inexpensively as possible. And if you build at a surface right of way and you still have traffic coming in and out, there's limits to how fast you can go through a well-traveled area. So Long Beach Line, you're going past a lot of streets, boulevards, you've got red lights. And on top of that, the trains can't be that long because they stop sometimes and they'll take up a whole block and they can't have it back into the train sticking out and blocking an intersection. So that creates some limits. So part of it is how it's built. And unless you're tunneling or having a dedicated right of way, like the Orange Line busway, basically on a former streetcar line, it's going to be really hard to get that speed up and running. But the other part of it is that the way we build in California is we tend to not want to interfere with automobile traffic. So if there's a red light, the train's got to stop. God forbid the train slows down automobile traffic. Makes no sense in the world, but those are the demands we put on our train system. I think trains are carrying a hell of a lot more people than an individual bunch of passenger cars. Right. We should be giving them priority, and that would help speed things up. So they could operate a lot faster. It is insane to me every time I see a rail car stop at a red light.
Yeah, there's sort of something surreal about that. Like, that's not for a train.
You might as well have made a bus line. Right. If you're just going to stop this thing, why don't you just save everybody a couple $100 million and let's just have some buses running. Muni in San Francisco is a classic example of that. It has maybe it has some signal priority, but not that I know of. It's like a glorified bus in a lot of parts. It's only in Muni when you're down in the tunnels. Right. And then you start to go really fast. And, you can still mimic some of that on a surface right away. And some South American cities have shown how that's done. Oftentimes it means taking a lane away from traffic, and that's a political no-no here. But you see the Wilshire bus rapid transit line getting built in little chunks across.
After 15 years now at this point?
Yeah, it was been a long battle. And if you were able to sacrifice a freeway lane for buses, that would be tremendous advantage for people. Imagine if there were regular shuttles, leaving from, again, Santa Monica, or maybe it's Pasadena, heading into downtown LA, leaving every 15 minutes, and you were just on a straight shot, buzzing right by all the cars. That would be better than a rail line for a lot of people. It'd be more convenient, and it'd be a lot cheaper too.
It's one of those other facts I think everybody must know who's involved, but nobody really acknowledges that in a lot of countries, for example, I'll be going to South Korea this summer recording some interviews. In a lot of countries, people choose the train over driving because driving is much slower. It's because the trains offer an advantage besides being cheaper. I was hearing a guy that I will be interviewing in Seoul saying one trip there, he did the same trip on the train and in a car. The car took an hour. The train took 6 minutes. So are conditions going to have to somehow get to that point in Los Angeles before we see a real shift? Does driving have to just become agonizingly difficult and expensive?
Well, I actually think we're already there. I think, in terms of the agonizingly difficult part, I think we're there.
What happens in place?
What we haven't gotten is a way to find that transit alternative, to prioritize transit. And again, it would mean taking a lane away in a lot of cases, but you would provide a huge value proposition for so many people. And you're absolutely right. It's a function of time. And if you can tell people you'll save time, you will get professionals who will ride it. There's a reason why, a politician would hop on a subway, not just for the photo op, but if they can get them very faster and they don't have to stick in the traffic, that's a huge value proposition. So when you think about the time savings, that really for most people is the biggest factor. And, as much as people love rail, part of why I think they love rail is they think it's going to get them someplace in a dependable, very fast way. But the fact is there are low-cost transit alternatives that if they can replicate that, they'll be just as valuable. So in other words, the rail is not as important as just fast, what it represents to people, the fast nature of it, the timeliness, schedule, et cetera, et cetera. And if you had a bus system that was, just as fast, it would be no problem to attract people to that line. You've seen it, for example, the Chinatown buses in the East Coast. They're very cheap, they're very fast, easy to get on. They're a lot cheaper than Amtrak, and basically just as fast. So, that's really the key for people, is providing a great service. It's not about the technology. It's just that people, associate the technology with a certain type of service. But LA could do a lot immediately rather than waiting, another 25 years for a subway to come out here to Westwood. In the meantime, we could be doing a lot just with the existing infrastructure we have if we're willing to make some choices to prioritize that sort of fast transit experience over the status quo.
There was that line that I believe Max Planck said, that science advances by funerals, meaning that the scientists who backed the old theories, they have to fall away before the new one's going to replace them. You don't convert the old scientists. And it seems like there is a sense that that's the way transit in Los Angeles has to go as well. It's the newcomers and even the youngest generation who has to gain more influence, because there's not a whole lot of winning of hearts and minds and the people who really want it to be 1962 again, is there?
I think there is some truth to that. I mean, I was mentioning earlier the generational change and how important that will be to fashioning a new city. So I think there is some truth to that. But I guess I also feel like people do come around. Marty,
what does it usually take?
Well, sometimes it takes reaching that tipping point. It takes things not working out the way people expected it. Marty Wax, for example, is a well-known transit expert in LA who was involved in sort of fighting a lot of the rail development. But, I heard him say the other night at an event on my book that, he thinks rail transit can be appropriate now in LA. He sort of recognizes the reality that this has already happened, that we've got this, multi-billion dollar, multi-decade long investment in the system. So, the fact that it's happening is pretty huge right there. You think about, kind of going back to the Obamacare thing. I mean, think of the opposition to Social Security or Medicare. And at some point, these things just become entrenched, and they're just part of the fabric of our life. And now it's a question. You're not going to go back and relitigate old battles. You're just going to start thinking about it in a forward-looking way. Where are we going?
It takes a certain amount of almost what we have so far of the Los Angeles Metro rail system is it's a partial proof of concept. It's less a transit system we have than a setup we can point to and say, look, this is operating, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Unfortunately, though, the system is not going to the highest ridership areas at this point. Extending it down Wilshire will be a major, major step in that direction. It really should have been the first line built. So once that opens, that will be a real sea change, I think, for the system. Expo line as well, opening to Santa Monica, will now connect a whole different group of highly densely populated part of the region into the rail network, and then the regional connector allowing seamless light rail service from Pasadena down to Long Beach and out to Santa Monica. That's also really going to fill in the gaps. LAX, I think, is overblown in the impact of it. I mean, it's a big psychological thing, and everyone's sort of a political symbol. Right. Everyone thinks it will add a lot of convenience to their lives. But the reality is it will never be a really great connection to LAX. Right. Most people will probably still continue to get rides from friends or family to the airport.
I use the flyaway bus myself.
I was going to say, and then the flyaway bus is going to be cheaper and easier for most people. So it's more of a psychological thing than the actual kind of ridership thing. Right. And part of it is, selling LA to tourists who come in that they can just hop on a train and get up to downtown. And, but BART, there's sort of that too. It sort of fits into the European travel mode or the Asian travel mode. Right. I mean, not to say that we shouldn't connect it to LAX, but I think, that it's, people overstate the importance of that. I think the other things, extending the subway out, the regional connector, and the Expo line are going to be much more significant to rail ridership.
It's true. Even if the Green Line connected, even if the Crenshaw line got built and got connected, I would still be on that flyaway because it goes downtown. But, I also think every other major city on the West Coast, San Francisco, there's a train from the airport to downtown. Seattle, there is. Vancouver, there is.
Oakland.
Okay. There we go. Yeah. So it's very common. Yet it's going to be one of those situations where Los Angeles it seems like it'll be left as the last one where that doesn't happen, where there isn't a train downtown. I mean, of course, my dream scenario is somehow the Purple Line just keeps going west, then curves down to LAX and gets in. But is there any potential political world where that could happen?
No, I don't think so. Not probably in our lifetimes. I mean, we're talking about such a long time frame. I mean, just for it to come to Westwood, they're saying 2036, 2037, which in reality is probably 2045 or 2048. So when you start thinking of those time frames, to get it, all the way down to LAX is going to be too long. And also the plans are, if it ever happens, tentatively, to bring it north, actually, towards Van Nuys, maybe through Westwood. So the subway is not going to connect, but the Crenshaw line will connect in some way, and that will actually create a pretty more direct route into downtown because the Crenshaw line sort of bends northeast and then would connect to the Expo line, potentially one day to the Red Line, and so that's not a bad connection. And also, if you can you kind of take it straight up, not just to downtown, but then you can start to access some of the different West Side communities. So that connection will help. But even if you had a rail line that took you right into LAX is a big old horseshoe. I mean, where is it going to drop you off where it's going to be convenient? You're going to have to hop onto something. I mean, and BART in San Francisco, it takes you right to, I think, Terminal 1. then you still have to hop onto a people mover. So there's never going to be a direct connection. And even if there was, you'll have to hop onto something else. So, but I think you will have a people mover from a Crenshaw station that will circulate through. Or this is what I think should happen. A people mover would circulate through LAX and take you to an outlying station that doesn't slow down the vast majority of riders who are not going to LAX, but just taking the Crenshaw line, north-south.
There's something so disheartening about the number 2036 before the subway gets even out here. I mean, hearing that alone would make a lot of people vote with their feet by moving away, I would think. Just like, 2036. But do you think, I mean, as you say, it's probably, maybe that means 2045, but might it mean some sooner time as well? Might there be a way might things speed up, if there is this sort of shift in the way people live in Los Angeles?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a depressing number too. I think it's actually an absurd number. I mean, you go back to that word. There's no reason for it to take that long. Right. It didn't used to take that long. 100 years ago, they could build things, a lot quicker. Now, granted, technology's changed. It's a little more complex to do this. You have more safety regulations, some good things that we like. And part of it is cost. It just things cost a lot of money. The real estate costs more, copper costs more, all the construction material, et cetera. But, if people wanted it to go faster, it could. There's no question. Passing Measure R was really important in 2008. Potentially in 2016, there'll be another sales tax measure that they can issue bonds against and borrow essentially against that revenue stream, pay for it. But there also is this question of how long the construction process takes, which is a separate question. And I don't know why people tolerate the length of time to build these things. I mean, the Expo line, groundbreaking was in 2006. It was supposed to be out to Santa Monica, I think, this year. In fact, not even sooner than that. So everything has gotten pushed back, and it doesn't make any sense. And part of it is, again, these safety regulations, all these things that are important. But a lot of it, to my mind, is that we just don't have enough political pressure to get these things built quickly and cheaply, and we sort of let the contractors essentially buy their way into these contracts because they can contribute to the elected officials on the Metro board making the contracting decisions. There's very little incentive to kind of monitor them and make sure it happens. You think about the contrast when our automobile infrastructure takes a while. I mean, here in LA, when Interstate 10 collapsed after the Northridge quake, that was a major artery that was down. They got that thing rebuilt right away because there was political pressure. The Maze, which is a series of highway interchanges in San Francisco, a truck caught on fire, kind of melted it. It shut down a major, sort of crossways or crossroads for interstates. That was rebuilt, way beyond schedule or way ahead of schedule. And again, political pressure. So we don't see that political pressure. Nobody is just, up in arms about how long it's taking to build a surface light rail line out to Santa Monica on an existing right of way. Right. But there should be an outcry over this, and that would speed all of this up.
Now, I've aired, of course, a number of complaints about the Los Angeles Metrorail system here during this talk, but ultimately I'm a fan of it. But maybe I'm more of a fan of the prospect of it connecting Los Angeles, as you say, connecting the at least miles west of Western Avenue on Wilshire. I go down to Wilshire, La Brea, or Fairfax, La Cienega, and think this neighborhood's okay now, but it'll be pretty damn cool when an actual subway stops here. I mean, what do you think about the more connected future of Los Angeles? Is that an exciting prospect to you? Is your enthusiasm dampened by all of the political battles you've had to document and retell in Railtown?
Well, I guess, my take on the whole system is I'm just amazed it even got built.
Right.
I mean, seeing all the forces against it. So I'm just still sort of in awe that anybody was able to get it done. I think the future of LA is very positive, but not necessarily because of rail. I mean, I think we're filling in around the rail stops. Koreatown is a great example of that. But also LA neighborhoods are changing on their own. Again, we don't have to wait till 2036 to have a great neighborhood. And there is a lot more attention paid to, putting in place the plans we need to see exciting neighborhoods, arise. And again, with that market shift, with the new generations and new sort of demographics in LA, it's already sort of happening organically. So I think in that sense, LA has a very bright future and is sort of ahead of other parts of the country in an interesting way. Now the future for rail, I think it is positive because we are seeing the subway line go out. Every foot farther west down Wilshire it goes, it means more riders, basically. So that's huge. It's starting to acquire some really key territory and get much more political buy-in now, because the more riders you serve, the more people are invested in the system. It's what happened in the Bay Area. BART is a very precious thing now to voters in the Bay Area. And the same thing is going to happen to Metrorail. I think you sort of saw that in 2008 to have 2/3 support for Measure R. So that's really huge. And then again, with Expo coming to Santa Monica, the regional connector moving forward in Crenshaw. And, I'm not really excited about the Gold Line extension out to Azusa. I mean, it's not a part of the region that really is in desperate need of rail like other parts. And it's not really serving a ton of transit-oriented opportunities. And it's such a slow line up to Pasadena anyways. I mean, that whole line was built for political reasons, because you had some powerful politicians who really wanted it to happen. But, I mean, just from a ridership perspective, I personally don't see the logic there ahead of other areas that probably could use rail first. I mean, West Hollywood, for example, should have a light rail before Azusa.
Yeah, why is there seemingly no chance of that?
Well, it's expensive, and they, again, when you have all the region coming together, you got to throw a bone to everybody to get them on board. You wouldn't have gotten the buy-in from the San Gabriel Valley folks if you didn't say, okay, you're going to get your rail line. David Dreyer, Republican in Congress, was really wanted to see rail come out to his district, and so he provided that critical bipartisan support in Congress to appropriate money for Metrorail in general. So that was part of the sacrifice, basically, to get the other lines built. So maybe you just have to sort of acknowledge that. Can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but we're also talking about, billions of dollars in investment, locking in decisions for generations. I wish we had a system that didn't force that kind of thing to happen. Right. Because, like I say, West Hollywood deserves a light rail line based on its density much sooner than, commuters driving in from San Gabriel Valley. And, the other thing is that it's a suburban area out there. Maybe to be better served with a busway, with commuter shuttles, sort of Google Bus for San Gabriel Valley. A nice, plush Wi-Fi bus. It would be a lot cheaper, provide a better service for people. It would be up and running a lot faster, and it wouldn't cost a lot of money to operate, which would cannibalize the budget for other parts of the city or the region. So, but we don't want to make those decisions because politicians want to say they brought a rail project home, even if it means it's going to take 15, 20 years to get it done.
Maybe they'll get a statue of themselves built at the station. You never know.
Or they get the stations named after them.
That's true. That's another fair point.
Always a good perk.
Could we say then that it's impressive that rail has come to Los Angeles, but it's somehow more impressive that Los Angeles seems to be coming to rail in a way?
Well, it took a long time. And I think parts of LA have always been pro-rail, even dating back to the 60s, the sort of height of the car boom, although it was also the height of, air quality and traffic and everything. People in the city of LA, the densely urbanized part of LA, were always supportive. The challenge was getting the whole county to vote on it. When you have a county as big and diverse as this, it's really hard to get that consensus. In the Bay Area, if the whole Bay Area had to vote on BART, I don't know if it would have passed, but the whole Bay Area didn't have to vote on BART. The only counties that had to vote were San Francisco County, Alameda, and Contra Costa. So those were core urban areas, and they said, yes, please, let's start it. San Mateo County could drop out, but in LA, they needed the people in Lancaster to say yes, which is insane. So that was the real challenge here. But eventually did get to that point. I think they stumbled on a solution in 1980, which is to have a balanced transportation sales tax measure. So it was bus, it was highways, it was local money, and it was rail. And once they did that, they sort of threw enough bones to everybody that they could get it started. So that's sort of how it came about. But we haven't talked about this at all, but LA has always had a robust transit system, which is the bus system. Right. And that's and sometimes it's sort of butted heads against the rail lines, but that's an important thing to keep in mind.
The rapid transit distinction to be made, though.
Yeah, exactly. And
not that some rail lines go that much faster than a bus, but still.
Yeah, no, that's true. But some bus lines are going faster. If they're like the Orange Line, for example. Right. So that is something to keep in mind. There are people who live in LA and have not been able to afford a car, and so they've been dependent on transit. So that lifestyle has existed. It's just now rail is something that essentially is something that middle class commuters, riders, residents can take advantage of now, and that it's attracting a different demographic, which is, I think, positive. I mean, I don't think we want a transit system just dominated by people who don't have the income level or are, the transit dependent in some way. I mean, I think we want, everyone to feel invested in this system. And the hope is that the rising tide lifts all boats. We saw that to some extent, just as it took buses and highways, to help rail get on the ballot and get approval. It also took rail on the ballot to bring in a coalition of people to support further investments in bus. And I think the bus system in LA has benefited from rail In some ways, in kind of negative ways, they had to sue the rail agency, but they got rapid buses out of that. You have the Metro Orange Line going. And again, you've just seen more people interested in it because a lot of people can now start to think about buses as a connector to get to a rail station. So
it's not just a change in the infrastructure of the city, but it's a change in the way that people that follow it to the city, newcomers, people newly born here, think about it, is it not?
Yeah, it's sort of a cultural shift, an identification shift. Tom Bradley talked a lot about that when he was first advocating for it in the 70s. About it was, and some people labeled it derisively an inferiority complex. But he talked about the need to have a world-class city, the convenience and what that would do to LA, to Angelenos, with their sense of their city and belonging to the sort of pantheon of great cities around the world. So
it's always the first complaint from other people who come here. It's like, why do you hate Los Angeles so much? Well, no transit. Or the driving,
Yeah, no, and you know what? It hurts the region economically too, because it makes it harder to lure, talented workers here. People are maybe less likely to start a business here. There's high cost of living. It's hard to get around. Goods movement is really impaired. So, it's not just even the cultural thing, or the sort of image thing, but it's also just about sort of getting the business of living done in LA. And it's hard to get that done when everyone's sort of, stuck in molasses on the freeway. So no, it is a number one challenge in LA. I mean, of course, schools and healthcare and everything else are important too. But, at a very basic level, it affects everyone. And it's about how we get around. And that does define us to some extent. But it also can be an attractive thing to get people to want to come here. And I think part of it is LA is selling a different image of itself now. Not necessarily intentionally. I mean, but it's just come about organically with the embracing of the rail system and the embracing of a different lifestyle. And that is the biggest misconception I think people have about LA. They sort of think of it as a monocultural place. And it's extremely diverse. And not just diverse in terms of all the ethnic, racial, nationalities, all those groups that are here. It's also diverse in terms of how you can live. I mean, when I lived in Santa Monica and I worked in Santa Monica before I went to law school, I rode my bike every day to work, and that was no problem at all. I actually had a very convenient lifestyle. You can have that in LA. I mean, I think the secret to success in LA, move to the place where you're spend most of your activity and don't leave.
Don't work in the entertainment industry either.
Yes, exactly. Ironically, I was working in entertainment, but I chose a company that was close to where I was living, and that made a big difference. And I had that luxury. Not everybody does, but, some of it was just fortuitous, but I was sort of willing to make sacrifices in that respect. But it does make a big difference in terms of quality of life.
I've been speaking here at the UCLA School of Law with Ethan Elkind, who is a writer and researcher on environmental law. He's a lawyer, and he is the writer as well of the new book Railtown, The Fight for the Los Angeles Metrorail and the Future of the City. Also, he's a musician. You can get one of his albums, both of your albums, or just one? Both. On your website, ethanelkind.com. Ethan, thanks so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with all the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kadlubowski, Peter Kavanaugh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.